Welcome to Savage Minds. I'm your host, Julian Vigo. Today's guest is Professor David Miller, a non-resident senior research fellow at the Center for Islam and Global Affairs at Istanbul Zaim University and a former professor of political sociology at the University of Bristol. He is a broadcaster, writer, and investigative researcher, the producer of the weekly show Palestine Declassified on Press TV, and the co-director of public interest investigations, of which spinwatch.org and powerbase.info are projects. I welcome David Miller to Savage Minds. I'm so pleased to finally speak with you, David, and you'll be happy to know you've saved me from this kind of car crash on my Facebook wall of feminists in 7 October. It's phenomenal. The hasbara project is proven successful because since 7 October occurred, I found myself wondering if I was living in some kind of parallel universe where suddenly facts no longer matter.
Sure.
I would like to kick off with perhaps a subject that you are sick of, but I think this is a good entry into some of the things that we've been witnessing from Israel, the Hasbara project, and the more recent buyout of media and social media on behalf of the Zionist lobby in the US especially. You were a professor of political sociology at the University of Bristol, and you were accused of antisemitism. A lot of our listeners are not familiar with your story because this happened under the cloak of independent media that covered it and was not widespread, but major media also tended to skirt around some of the more egregious facets of the case that you were facing at the time. Could you please go over what happened to you?
Okay, well, it's a long story, but I started working at the University of Bristol in 2018. In February 2019, I did a lecture on Islamophobia, where I spent approximately 4 or 5 minutes talking about the extent to which Zionism encourages Islamophobia. It's one of the factors which encourages Islamophobia. A couple of students in the class complained anonymously to the Community Security Trust, which is a charity which says it's there to combat antisemitism, but which is in fact there to enforce Zionist views and narratives throughout the country. The university wouldn't accept that complaint because the organisation is not a student. The students wouldn't make the complaints directly themselves, even anonymously. So therefore, this lobby group, the Community Security Trust, approached the head of the Jewish Society at the university, which is called the Bristol JSOC, Bristol Jewish Society, which is part of the Union of Jewish Students, and they had also previously approached the president of the National Union of Jewish Students, and they together put in a letter of complaint which couldn't be accepted from the president of the UJS, but could be from the president of the JSOC because she was at that stage a student. She put in a complaint. It was rejected by the dean of the faculty who investigated it some months later. Took about 6 months. And then the student complained that the complaint hadn't been undertaken underneath the authority of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of antisemitism, which the university had not adopted by that stage. So the university unilaterally offered the student to pause the complaint while the university considered whether they would introduce the IHRA definition, and they decided some months later that they would introduce the IHRA and that the complaint would be the appeal against the complaint would be taken underneath the authority of the IHRA. So they then reactivated the complaint under new rules, and they appointed an external, what was then a QC is now a KC, Queen's Counsel is now a King's Counsel, so we now have a king instead of a queen. And that inquiry was in the middle of COVID, and it took, 6, 8, 9 months. So by the December of 2020, so that's 18, 19, 20 months after the initial complaint or the initial lecture, the QC filed her report, which concluded that there were no cases to answer. There's no case to answer on any of the charges. That nothing I'd said ever, including complaints, including statements I'd made some years prior to even joining the University of Bristol. None of these statements were anti-Semitic in any way, and therefore there was no case to answer. So that was that. The university then would not tell anyone that I'd been found not guilty. And so I was still getting defamed in the media. I asked the university to help. They wouldn't help. They wouldn't publish the report. And so I went on a public meeting and said that I'd be attacked and complained about, and those were the exact words that I used, by the president of the JSOC and the president of the Union of Jewish Students, which are, of course, Zionist organizations. I don't know if I mentioned that. And then all hell broke loose. It was said that I was endangering students, and there was all sorts of complaints in the media. Many people from outside the university wrote asking for me to be sacked, including over 100 members of the Houses of Parliament, that's the Commons and the Lords. And there was no formal complaint, but the university nevertheless took upon itself to introduce a new inquiry, and they sent this to a QC as well, and that QC report also concluded that I had not been anti-Semitic in any way. And nevertheless, the university decided on the basis of that and an internal inquiry which they were running in parallel that I had not been professional and that they would sack me. And that was on the 1st of October 2021. And then I took them to an industrial tribunal and said that they'd wrongly sacked me. The tribunal concluded in February 2020, where are we now? 2023, I think it was, or was it 2024, that I had been wrongfully sacked. And not only that, but that I had been discriminated against on the basis of my anti-Zionist beliefs. So I said that I'd been sacked because I was an anti-Zionist. The court determined that that was true and that anti-Zionist views were worthy of protection in a democratic society, which is the formal language from the Equality Act. So the court determined that I had been discriminated against on the basis of my anti-Zionist views, and that anti-Zionist views were protected under the Equality Act. So that established that for the first time. And the very last part of the story is that the university is now appealing my victory, and there will be a 2.5-day case in November this year to determine whether the decision of the court will be overturned or not.
And despite your victory, you were not reinstated at Bristol, were you?
That's right. I haven't been reinstated. I have not got an academic job anymore. I will not ever be given an academic job in this country as a result of this attack on me by the Zionists.
And then earlier this year, I mean, this isn't the end for you. You have been privately prosecuted by the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism under the Communications Act of 2003. What were their accusations? It seems like there's a free-for-all on you, and there's a concerted effort to shut you up.
Well, that's true. The Campaign Against Anti-Semitism are taking out a private prosecution against me on the basis, they said, first of all, 3 tweets that I'd sent, and they've now added a 4th tweet, which they want to add to the charges, which they say were menacing. And these are tweets which I sent, which call for Zionists to be held accountable before the law. And they say that what I really mean when I say these things is that I'm really asking for people to target the Jews as opposed to, and with violence, as opposed to calling for Zionists to be found and held accountable for their crimes, both in occupied Palestine and indeed in this country, where many Zionists are involved on a daily basis in giving material support to the genocide.
We're seeing a repeat of the same pattern all over the place. From last week's Manchester attack, that was used by certain people in the British government to try and goad, if not intellectually blackmail, people wishing to peacefully protest the genocide in Gaza as being un-British. That was one of the statements that were made. There were many statements to that effect.
Sure.
And you know Heather Brunskill-Evans. She was in the first group of arrested people protesting the very day that the prescription for Palestine Action was brought into vigor. She was arrested for standing with a peaceful sign saying, I support Palestine action and protesting the genocide in Gaza. Meanwhile, this past week, I found a load of people on TikTok and on X who've made videos going straight up to the police officers and saying, hey, I support genocide. Why don't you arrest me? And why are you arresting these peaceful protesters? It was quite the performance. I rather love that.
Yes.
And then skip to Nick Cohen's latest piece in The Spectator. Well, maybe not the latest, but from 3 October, where he actually supports very clearly this definition of anti-Semitism that has been invigorated over the past year, but more so, but for the past year, people have been discussing this. Now, why is the new or the old new definition of anti-Semitism important here? Because that feeds into who is and who is not classified as an anti-Semite. And this is insane because Nick Cohen wrote at one point, I'm paraphrasing, that I find the demands of the Greens quite reasonable. It's online. One can find it under jewishgreens.greenparty.org.uk, guidance on anti-Semitism and dealing with accusations. I went through this list the other day, and it has a list of do's and don'ts, which is a sure sign of Article 10, right? We have our freedoms. Don't allow feelings of discomfort to silence potential discussion. That's good. But don't respond to journalists from unregulated publications. Don't assume all accusations are made in bad faith, even when they are incorrect, et cetera, et cetera. So basically, we're given this kind of Politburo list from this organization within the Green Party that Nick Cohen finds reasonable. This is all an extension of the
The IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition. Yes.
That's it. And that organization has had a huge impact on who gets to look or sound anti-Semitic or not.
Yeah, but let me just say a couple of things. First of all, as we know from various reporting, including, of course, the sterling reporting of Max Blumenthal, but the guy who did the attack in Manchester is a supporter of the Mossad MI6 CIA puppet who currently rules Damascus. And so the idea that this is a man who was carrying out an attack on the Jews as part of an attempt to fight back against Zionism is laughable, since, of course, Giuliani and his like will not attack Israel. And, of course, the other thing to mention about this is that the police, of course, killed one of the two victims who were killed, as well as the alleged attacker, and shot, I think, one of the other people who were injured. It's not entirely clear what kinds of injuries were inflicted by the attacker on the one person who died and the other person, or possibly two persons who were injured. Now, the thing I would say, second of all, about that, so it's not just a question of first of all, what I'm saying is I'm raising the possibility that there are at least questions to answer about the involvement of the intelligence services in this attack, because, of course, people of that ideological lineage are people who work with MI6 and have worked with MI6 to undermine the Assad government and eventually to remove the Assad government in Syria. And we saw the same kind of questions with Salman Abedi, the Manchester bomber from several years ago, who, of course, was transported by British intelligence to Libya to remove Colonel Gaddafi, the Libyan leader, and then was evacuated on an RAF ship back to Manchester, and then subsequently carried out the Manchester attack. Now, there's no need for us to say that MI6 sent these people to do these operations, but there are questions about the extent to which there has been MI6 involvement with these individuals, and if so, what responsibility they therefore bear for the attacks. Now, the second thing to say is that there's been this massive outpouring of political wailing and gnashing about this being an anti-Semitic attack. Well, there's no clear evidence so far that this was an attack on that synagogue on the basis that these people were Jews. We don't know that was the motivation, and that would have to be shown to be the motivation in order for this to be an anti-Semitic attack, as opposed to an attack on a synagogue on the basis of it being Zionist. Now, it is a Zionist synagogue. It's a Chabad synagogue, and so we simply don't know the basis of the attack. And it would, of course, be wrong to attack civilians in a synagogue. But nevertheless, the question about whether this is specifically anti-Semitic, I think, is an open one. Now, the other questions on the IHRA, look, the IHRA is an intergovernmental organization set up by the Israelis and is a vehicle for Israeli foreign policy agendas. The definition was, of course, the responsibility for the new definition of the new anti-Semitism was something which, of course, the Zionist regime have been working on for many, many decades, including back to a famous speech by the former foreign minister of the entity, Abba Eban, where he made a speech in America about the new anti-Semitism. And this is a definition worked upon by the Zionist government and regime and its agencies, including, of course, the Mossad, who were in the 1980s in charge of the whole question of anti-Semitism globally. And has also been worked upon by other key Israel lobby groups and Zionist groups in the West, including, of course, the Community Security Trust, which complained about me, and other groups in the US, for example, the American Jewish Committee, the ADL, etc., etc. So this is a definition which has been brought in order to blur the distinction between racism against Jews as Jews or prejudice against Jews as Jews, and criticism of Israel. And as everyone has said, who looks at the 15 appended examples which may be used as indications of anti-Semitism, most of them are, of course, criticisms of Israel. Now we're way past the time where any criticism of Israel, no matter how intemperate or how offensive, can be regarded as being racism against the Jews. It's simply absurd. And the quicker that we get rid of the IHRA and that universities who have signed up to it, like, for example, the University of Bristol, where I was appointed, the better. I mean, this is a transparently ideological definition which needs to be removed and needs to be consigned to the dustbin of history.
Well, I completely agree, because what they are calling for here, I mean, just a few of the examples, drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis, holding Jews collectively responsible for actions of the State of Israel. These are subjective queries on the one hand, and on the other, it does great injustice to actual anti-Semitism, sort of what I'm dealing with on my Facebook wall now, where Believe All Women and the carpeting of hasbara propaganda through extremely aged racist tropes of Arabs and Muslims is now the pathway to understanding why there really were rapes that every single organization and reporters like Max have been demonstrating to be false. The problem is that now we're living in this weird sphere. You're on X too, so you see the crazy. Yesterday was pretty bad, where people want to cherry pick their own version of reality. And it's almost as if, because of the Holocaust, because of what happened, I mean, the tragedy of what happened in the 1940s, to not only Jews, but to other groups during the Second World War, means that we can no longer speak of other tragedies. And it's ironic, because you've got that infamous query by Theodor Adorno, if there can be poetry after the Holocaust. And my question to him, if he were still here, is, can one speak of other Holocausts? Can we speak of genocide? Because we know from Fanon, I mean, every single theorist working on issues of post-colonialism, even to pedagogists who look at the way in which oppressed groups can also become oppressors. And I'm wondering why the people defending the acts of genocide in Gaza currently don't seem to be able to walk and chew bubblegum. Both are true. One can be historical offspring of a horrible genocide and be participant in another. And why do you think it is that this is happening en masse? We're seeing British and Americans who are continuing the hasbara propaganda despite facts under their nose.
Well, I mean, the decision or the practical production of the Nazi genocide as the only significant or the worst genocide is, of course, something which the Zionists have been working on for a long time. You mentioned Adorno, and I think it's interesting to have a little think about Adorno's role here. Of course, he and Max Horkheimer were involved in not just in the CIA's Congress and Cultural Freedom, but they also worked for the American Jewish Committee when they were in the States, including when they wrote some of their most famous works, including The Authoritarian Personality. It's very interesting that we have that kind of hidden history. So when I went to university and was taught critical theory, these were simply people who were Marxists. They were refugees from Nazism. Yes, they were Marxists and they were writing critical theory. But the idea that they had been working in a Zionist institution in the US was not something which it was ever mentioned to me. It wasn't even regarded as something which was a fact. I didn't even know it until, of course, much later. So that whole process by which the Nazi genocide has been elevated to being the most important one. And then people say sometimes it's because the Jews are white, and there's all that kind of argument about it. I don't think that that's necessarily the most important thing. The most important thing is to say, look, of course there were other genocides, and of course the Germans and indeed British were involved in such genocides, but we do not remember them because they haven't had the wealth of hasbara is the right word for it, to institutionalize the understanding. We haven't had the Hollywood films about the Belgian Congo. We haven't had the massacres of the Herero people. We haven't had these as central cultural references in Western societies in the way that we have for the Nazi genocide. And of course, amongst the victims of the Nazi genocide, the Jews are the ones who are the most important according to our cultural memory. People in this country, in the UK, don't know that it wasn't the West, it wasn't the US, it wasn't the UK who beat the Nazis. It was the Soviet Union, and that they lost 27 million people in that effort. And so there's been a wholesale recasting of history, of course, not just of the 1939-45 war, the Great Patriotic War, as it was called in Russia, but also of the entire episode of colonial history and colonial genocide, which, as you mentioned, of course, Frantz Fanon wrote very convincingly about, as did many other great writers.
You know, I'm thinking about the AJC, in fact, because it was founded at the beginning of the 20th century, around 1906 or 5, I think. This organization was there to advocate Zionism. It was there to also combat anti-Semitism and promote the state of Israel. What a lot of people currently on my Facebook page arguing about the alleged rapes on 7 October don't realize is that there's so much propaganda undergirding even their own sentiments. I find it really shocking when we've got case after case of journalists debunking these myths, and we have Zaka representative being debunked in Israel's own newspapers, and yet the preference to believe, well, women are always raped in war, I was told this morning, so it's not hard to believe that this happened. And I said, well, that means that every time you open your faucet, that I can claim that it's Noah's Ark time, that there's a flood in my house. This is not logical. We need facts to speak of what happened on 7 October. We need facts to actually look at what happened in the creation of the State of Israel. I've had several guests on the show who've spoken about the origins of Zionism. And I think the one facet missing in the major media representation, for sure, is why Zionism is never really addressed full on for the racist ideology that it is. I think a lot of people have still conflated Zionism with Judaism, which is why the working definition of anti-Semitism from the IHRA in its propaganda conflates the very two. Because to separate would mean to actually admit that one is an ethnic stroke religious identity and the other is ideological propaganda.
Yeah, I mean, the origins of Zionism are pretty clear if you look back at the early writings of the Pinskers and the Herzls and or the Arthur Rupins, even the Nazi element of Zionist historiography. But there is a thing, there's a soft spot for Zionism on the left in the West, and so that people will say to you, I mean, in my case, I said, look, Zionism is fundamentally racist, fundamentally genocidal ideology. It can't be reclaimed. But there are many people on the left who say, well, Zionism means different things to different people. There are some people for whom it means a place of safety if there is ever any threat to the Jews or in the way that there was under the Nazis, and therefore they can't be regarded as being racists. Well, of course, a place of safety stolen from the indigenous people cannot be regarded as being something separate from the actual racist ideology of Zionism. It's the same thing. There is no distinction, and there is no nice Zionism. I had an ex-colleague of mine actually say to me that oh well, in the 1940s there were elements of the Zionist movement who didn't believe in a Jewish state, and they wanted a binational solution and all this kind of thing. And you say, okay, well, so let's go back and look and what happened to that current in the movement. And that current in the movement, of course, was the left current, in particular associated not with Labour Zionism, but with an organisation which was even more left-wing than the Labour Zionists of the first Israeli government, and they were called Hashomer Hatzair, and they argued in 1942 at the Biltmore Conference in the US that there should be a binational state, and that should be the objective, and they were defeated. And within 3 years, they had thrown in their lot with the revisionists and the Labour Zionists and joined the Palmach. And in fact, they were very senior amongst the people of the storm force of the Palmach, which was, of course, the Haganah's elite force, and they were involved directly in ethnic cleansing and in killing Palestinians with glee in the Nakba. So the idea that there is some innocent Zionism which didn't really believe in the Jewish state is something which foundered in practice in history on the willingness of the people who believed in it to fight for the Jewish state by killing and murdering Palestinians in order to establish their state. And that's the truth of it. There is no innocent Zionism. Zionism is irredeemably racist and irredeemably genocidal. It has to be genocidal because if it wasn't genocidal, there would be the possibility of a Palestinian state, and they can never tolerate that.
Well, absolutely. In fact, a lot of people are very clear from the moment of 7 October. Many people were saying, this genocide did not begin today. This has been ongoing. And you mentioned Haganah. In fact, there's a book that's verboten in Israel that I was given my first day there. I checked into where I was going to be living in the Armenian quarters of Jerusalem. I was doing research in the West Bank on the Second Intifada and the first female suicide bombers. I was given this book called Perfidy. And I read it. I couldn't stop reading it. Quite interesting. And it does discuss the terrorism within the origins of the Israeli state. This, however, is not what young Israelis are learning from the founding of the state to the present. In fact, I found myself really troubled in the first 24 hours I spent in Israel because it was like a crash course in realizing that I had been lied to by my own government, by my own media back in the United States. And I was prepared to be shocked. I was not prepared for this level of shock, David. Can you discuss how many Palestinians were displaced with the Nakba? Because a lot of our listeners are not aware of the massive violence that was done to Palestinians. And they do believe, a load of people still believe, the current situation has kicked off only 2 years ago.
Well, okay. I mean, obviously, everybody knows who has any contact with the reality. Even the Zionists know this and will admit this, that 750,000 people were displaced in the Nakba, and of course thousands and thousands were killed. There were many massacres, and the Zionists themselves have admitted involvement in these massacres. The famous film about the Tantura massacre, which came out recently, where there are veterans of the Haganah and the other terror gangs admitting what they did, admitting rapes, admitting abuse, admitting indeed, let's remember, the throwing of young children into ovens to be burned alive. And that, of course, is the kind of tale that they have told about October the 7th. Didn't happen then, but it did happen way back when they created their state by their ethnic cleansing pogroms against the Palestinian people at the time. Now, but this is not something which we should be surprised at. I mean, Zionism was always genocidal. It always had recognized, including amongst the left Zionists, that in order to establish the state, they would have to remove the indigenous population. Now, some of them, for example, Herzl, believed that you might have to use the Palestinians to make Palestine safe for the for the Jews coming from Eastern Europe by getting rid of the snakes and draining the swamps, for example. But after that, they would be deported to a third country, and that's in his writings. So this always been a genocidal ideology, and the idea that the genocide only happened 2 years ago is a mistake. They've always wanted to pursue a genocidal policy because they've always had to do that in order to remove the Palestinians from their land and in order to have a majority of Jews in the occupied territory in order there could be no democracy. That's the purpose of it. Exactly the same as the apartheid regime in South Africa, where they had a policy of Bantustans, as you recall, where black people would be put in these notionally self-governing, but actually having no ability to govern themselves, Bantustans, and that would leave a white majority. That was the purpose, a white majority in South Africa, so they could say to the rest of the world, aha, we are Democrats, just like the Israelis, of course, talk about the only democracy in the Middle East. This is the same thing. It's the intention has always been to rule and to find a way to rule, and the demographics, of course, are an important part of that. But it's also been the case that they've always not only wanted to remove the Palestinians, but also wanted to rule in Eretz Israel, which, of course, is the land of Israel. And in their mind, and this has always been the case, that Israel is not the bits that they were offered by the UN in 1948, and it's not all of Palestine as we currently conceive of it. It's also half of Lebanon, some of Turkey, most of Iraq, all of Syria, all of Jordan, and indeed half of Egypt. So that's what they think of as Greater Israel, and that's what they want to either occupy or control, and that's why they're pushing ever further into Syria, as we see when they invaded some months ago, and then only about a month ago they've extended their region of control in Syria. They then, of course, invaded Lebanon. They've been pushed back from most of the bits they invaded by the Lebanese resistance Hezbollah, but they still are occupying key elements on the borders which they didn't previously occupy, and they want to. And they've said this openly. They want to go into Jordan, into Egypt, and take control there. That, of course, is the basis for their notion of a Greater Israel. But they also want to have control on a sort of wider basis than that. And that's, of course, why they have been involved with the normalization process, the Abraham Accords, where they are able to exert control over, for example, the Saudis and the United Arab Emirates, the most Zionist of the Arab states in West Asia, and that is a plan for them to go forward to be effectively the unrivaled regional power in the whole of West Asia. That's their objective, and we should be more clear about understanding that that's what they want to do, and they want to establish, and they say this themselves, that although they don't use the word Reich, they want to establish a 1,000-year Reich, a 1,000-year rule over the entire region.
Well, when Ben-Gurion stepped into office, he implemented a policy which rewarded women for having 10 children or more. This policy was retracted after Palestinian women were also having 10 children. You talk about, in air quotes, a Reich, but to what degree this entire project, which was imagined even from Herzl or the Dreyfus Affair of the 19th century, there was a conference in Philadelphia at the turn of the century where American Jews were actually opposed to Zionism as a project. And you have obviously many outspoken Jews who are not on board with the program. I don't think that should even matter at this point because we should be beyond self-identity in this. It's very clear there's a genocide going on, yet somehow Israel knew that by having the kind of hasbara that was first written about, I believe, in Tablet, where the one journalist talks about the rape and the beheaded babies, and then this somehow took off. There was a influencer on Instagram who had a series of videos. She's like a failed American actor who went to Israel, made a career, was paid by the state of Israel to produce propaganda, and none of this went questioned. None of it. And there she is saying the same lies. And here I am waking up this morning to at least 100 posts on my Facebook wall by air quote feminists who are defending the lies. Despite not just Max, he did a great job, but you've got Mondovais, you've got even the Times and the Times of Israel, they debunked the lies. The Israeli police are saying, we have not had a person claim that she was raped. Somehow the feminists have just been given the bone that Israel knew they would take, and they've run with it. And not just them. I mean, the hasbara is everywhere. Why was such a successful operation possible, given that people on social media have the access to Google the information? It wasn't hard to find the truth about these myths. What do you think has gone on here? Because it's extremely troubling to me, not that social media takes off sometimes, okay, but that we have the ability to find the facts and to stop the myth-making or to stop sharing absolute fodder.
Well, I think that the instructive thing for me is that you sort of imagine that the rules of which govern discourse are such that you have an argument, and when something is shown to be false, that when it's shown that, for example, the beheaded baby story was false, or that the rape stories were false, or that the Hannibal directive had been implemented, and that therefore these the piles of cars which were incinerated had clearly been incinerated by hellfire missiles from the helicopters or from shells from the tanks, and not by the light arms carried by the Palestinian militants from Hamas and PIJ and the PFLP. So you imagine that the rules of discourse are that, we will now that it's been shown that there were no beheaded babies, we'll drop that, because it would be obviously be foolish to continue simply repeating the lies, because everybody knows that they're lies. And that's the strategy they've adopted, that they just continue to repeat the lies, and then they produce a new report which says, oh, there was all this sexual violence, or that that Hamas or the Palestinian resistance killed all these civilians, and they just repeat and repeat and repeat. And that's been successful. I mean, who would have thought that you could just lie and lie and lie, and that eventually that people would sort of forget that the lies have been debunked, or they would, in many cases, never know that the lies have been debunked because they've never seen Max or Mondovais or the alternative media, or even, of course, read the Times of Israel or read Haaretz critically, or all they have is the mainstream. And on the mainstream, the main source of information still for most people, even given social media, there is not a sense of any of this, that there's even a controversy, that there's even two sides to this. So I saw on the BBC, I think it was yesterday, some passing reference to the 1,200 people killed by Hamas on October the 7th, and you look at this and you think, which journalist is it? Which professional journalist in the mainstream has written this? Who actually believes that? And of course, probably some of them actually do still believe.
You're listening to Savage Minds, and we hope you're enjoying the show. Please consider subscribing. We don't accept any money from corporate or commercial sponsors, and we depend upon listeners and readers just like you. Now back to our show. I was really shocked recently. There's another journalist who's written a piece, I believe it was on Sunday, but The Lone Crazies Aren't as Scary as the Mob by Hadley Freeman. I read her stuff and I teeter between anger and laughter because she wrote this: the everyday hatred facing British Jews is more chilling than single attacks such as that in Manchester. Let's not mention the genocide in Gaza. If I were a family member of one of these two men killed, I would really be angry at feminists like this trying to cheapen the life of the person in my life who was just killed, drumming it into a political opportunity. And that's what's going on here. I have real questions about any feminism that uses the rape myths from 2 years ago to continue them on my Facebook wall today and elsewhere, because it's all over X as well, as a means of eschewing a moral obligation to addressing reality. This is what kills me about social media. It's great. Everyone can have a blog, everyone can have access to news, but no one seems to be using it because we all want to read the same three writers. And this becomes religious orthodoxy at a certain point, beyond even pure ideology. Given what has happened with the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's push for adopting this definition, and they've been pushing universities in the US to do this as well, right? So if you do not adopt, then you are questionable in the same way that you were made persona non grata. This is, to me, the greater problem. Academic freedom, let's begin there. Journalistic freedom, getting rid of these journalists that will make comments like that which you read yesterday that completely elide the mowing the lawn project of the IDF, or the completely elide, because very few journalistic representations over the past 2 years. I'm not talking about alternative media, but I have rarely seen the New York Times address the fact that this did not begin on October 7th, that this has a longer heritage of intervention and colonialism. And then you'll see people saying, well, those Gazans, they voted for Hamas. This was yesterday on my wall. And I said, are you aware of the surviving Gazans, the percentage of people who would have even been able to vote, given that half the population right now is under the age of 18? And we're talking about 2006, 19 years ago. So you've got, actually, I call it the political dumb and dumber. And I'm appalled. I'm appalled that feminism has become a key word now for racism. I find it very hard to take feminists seriously after all I have witnessed over the past 2 years. At the same time, you've got Norman Finkelstein, who's typically being called anti-Semitic. I imagine, well, you have been called anti-Semitic. There's a genocide. Let's keep the eyes on the ball here. Let's not worry about these minor details. Yet the attack on the Manchester mosque last week has proven to be yet another occasion for the British government to come out and say, in a way, they're making a stark confession here. By attending the protest this weekend, you are committing an act of anti-Semitism. That was the subtext.
Sure.
So my thought was, so are you saying that the propagating the state of Israel is in fact a collusion with the genocide? Because that's the other subtext to be drawn. Are they saying the quiet part out loud is what I had to wonder. And then I was speaking with people over the past week, since certainly the Manchester travesty. My first thought was, wait a sec. When I read a case like this in the States, a gunman goes into Walmart or a school and shoots people, I don't think anti-Semitism. I don't even think misogyny if the people shot happen to be women. I think of a stark raving mad individual. Is it possible, or will it ever be possible, that we can talk about a violent act against a Jewish person without that necessarily automatically being classified as anti-Semitic? Because this fits into, in a way, the working definition of anti-Semitism from the IHRA that has been consciously trying to propound the idea that accusing, I'm citing from their website right now, accusing Jews as a people of being responsible for real or imagined wrongdoings committed by a single Jewish person is verboten. But this is what they did with the Manchester individual last week. They've done exactly what the IHRA definition says is not allowed, but it's allowed if they're Assyrian.
If there wasn't, I mean, look, of course, there isn't a really serious problem of anti-Semitism in this country. There is a serious problem of Islamophobia. We've seen lots of attacks on mosques in the last week. which of course don't register in the mainstream media. And of course, it becomes impossible for any person to be critical of any Jewish person without that being seen as anti-Semitism. Now, Jewish people do bad things. Muslim people do bad things. Atheists do bad things, but they don't necessarily do those because they are Jewish or atheist or Muslim, and that shouldn't be the reason why people assume that they are doing them. So, but the problem is that you cannot criticize a person who happens to be Jewish for doing something like, I don't know, robbing a bank or whatever it is, without being accused of anti-Semitism in a way that you don't get accused for any other people. There's a sort of special status that the Jews have now, which means that you are accused of anti-Semitism for any mention of the Jews. I mean, I remember being accused by the CST of being anti-Semitic for using the term Jewry, i.e. the collective word for Jews, a word which, of course, the CST uses all the time. So it's a question of, when bad people say things, then that's obviously anti-Semitic. When we say it, obviously it's not, because that's completely different. So of course there's a total distortion of the way in which language is used. Look, the main form of racism in this country today is Islamophobia. It has been for a number of decades, and the reason for that, of course, is that racism as an institutional form in a society is always driven by the state, and we don't have institutional racism against the Jews driven by the state. It's not Jews who are stopped under Schedule 7 of the Terrorism Act when they come in and out of the country, like I have been and like many thousands of Muslims have been. It's not Jews who are stopped and searched regularly on the streets in Britain. It is Muslims, and it's, of course, black people as well. So that there isn't an institutional form of racism against the Jews in this country. It hasn't been for a long, long time. To the extent that there is any such thing as anti-Semitism as a form of racism in the country, is confined very much to the severe margins of the far right. Most of the far right, of course, now has flipped over into being pro-Israel, as you've seen, with the invite to go to Tel Aviv for Tel Aviv Tommy by Prime Minister Chickley. So, and of course, that's led to a little bit of consternation in the organised Jewish community, where some elements of the Jewish community are saying, "Oh, he's a bad man. He's a Nazi. He's a racist." And the Kudniks, the Beitar, and all of that are saying, "Leave Tommy Robinson alone. He's a fine patriot who supports Israel, etc." So that of course is all part of the mix. But there isn't really any significant problem of racism against the Jews in this country, and the sooner we get over that, and the sooner we understand that the reason that anti-Semitism is deployed is to distract attention from the genocide. That's the purpose of it, and that's why all the Israel lobby groups are going for every single professional that they can who has expressed solidarity with the Palestinians. That's why they're attacking medics, for example, like Dr. Rami Al-Adwin and Dr. Rihanna Ali, who are being attacked viciously, and many other professionals, lawyers and accountants and doctors and the like. So there's an attempt to make sure that there can be no active demonstration of solidarity with the Palestinians. And that, of course, is the same rationale which is behind the takeover of TikTok, the appointing of Barry Weiss as editor-in-chief of CBS. I mean, that's truly extraordinary. The attempt to take over CNN, the Ellisons emerging as this massive media mogul family to sit alongside the Murdochs, who also are, of course, viciously Zionist. But Ellison is a really interesting character because he is even more actively Zionist than Murdoch has been. You see from, and I think who's been reporting this? This has been reported in Max has been reporting this. The leaked or the hacked Benny Gantz emails,
right,
showing that Ellison's been in the war room in the entity. that has been central. I mean, of course, as everyone knows, that he's the largest ever recorded donor to the Friends of the Israel Defense Forces, that he has been involved with Trump in that famous meeting in January where they got this, was it a 500 billion contract or 500 million contract with Sam Altman from OpenAI? And so the involvement of Oracle in all of this, the digital ID push, the servicing of the Zionist entity itself, Oracle was the first company to open a data center in Israel, is something which we haven't seen the full contours of yet. And the fact that he's been plowing nearly $500 million into the Tony Blair Institute in the last 4 or 5 years is very, very instructive, especially given Blair being named as one of Donald Trump's Board of Peace, so that he'll be the British Vice Consul of Gaza. It's planned. So I mean, and of course, both Ellison and Blair have, Blair has been holidaying on Ellison's yacht off Sardinia in the summer, and so there's something very interesting going on there. But this is the purpose of this is, for, on the one hand, to squash all possible solidarity with the Palestinians in the media. That's the media takeover, and the other element of all possible resistance in Gaza by the development of the far-fetched beach condos on the beach in Gaza. So these are two parts of the same strategy, which involves all the same people.
Yeah, well, the investment in buying out social media posters to promote hasbara is also something. Yesterday I interviewed Nick Cleveland Scout about this. His amazing journalism on this subject was eye-opening and depressing, because now they're planning to artificially reprogram AI to parrot the talking points that it wants it to parrot. And this is all very frightening, because now we're in this very strange phase of now 2 years after, and you're still seeing people talk about how dangerous the Muslim world is for Jews. And I'm like, get a history book. They point to all the Moroccans, Algerians that went to Israel. And I said, no, there was Kadima with the Caisse des Immigrants Marocains, for instance, in Casablanca, which arranged and saw and verified the mass migration of Moroccans to Israel beginning around 1949. And it went on for many years. It wasn't that people were fleeing, as was the case in parts of Europe and the former Soviet Union. I think it's really important that people start to get a library card, as I like to tell them on Twitter, because there's a huge aporia. No, but it's like, let's just make up stuff. And I'm getting a little fed up now. I mean, Heather had it in her latest piece for us on the feminists who keep propounding the rape myths. I don't blame her. I mean, this idea that we can just say things and that makes it real. Yet these are the same feminists that take issue with men saying they're women, and that makes it real. To paraphrase Adolf Reed, it's not that there's bad Rachel Dolezal and good Bruce Jenner, or as his new name goes, I forgot his new name now. But this is the kind of disconnect that we're dealing with Israel. I think that the history of Jews finding safe haven in the Arab world has been completely elided as well. Not to mention, of course, the foreground to 7 October. What do you see as the outcome from this disastrous plan of putting Trump's son-in-law and Tony Blair in charge of this new plan? Because to me, it's like, I call it political dumb and dumber. I really don't know what to make.
Well, I mean, it's obviously going to fail, but the reality on the ground is that they cannot defeat either Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad, or indeed the other Palestinian factions who continue to fight. They can't defeat them, and so they have to find a way to try and move on politically. Now, of course, they've got this peace plan which Hamas signed up to a large extent, which Trump then praised Hamas for, leading to all sorts of wailing and gnashing of teeth in Tel Aviv. But obviously, we know, and Netanyahu's already said as much. We know that in Hebrew in the Knesset that the Israelis won't honor any treaty. I mean, they can't get themselves out of the habit of lying and cheating. So they're not going to sign up to that, but they think that if they have this peace process, or whatever it is, that will lead to them being able to displace the Palestinians and therefore to inflict a defeat on Hamas. I don't believe that will be possible. But nevertheless, they want to be able to exert military control over both the West Bank and Gaza, and indeed Lebanon and Syria. So we will see what happens with that. But it really depends on the outcome of what's coming, which will be another attack by Israel and indeed, one would bet, by the US on Iran. And that really is the end game about whether they can be successful. If they can engage with Iran and Iran doesn't fight back, then things could change. But it seems unlikely that would be the case, even given the kind of subversion that there is internally in Iran amongst the reformers, the so-called reformers, who have some significant power now, given that they've got the presidency of the republic. So that's all part of the calculations. But I mean, I can't see the Blair-Kushner plan being successful in its own terms. But nevertheless, that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to push through this idea to make Gaza a nice place, as Donald Trump fetchingly put it.
Yeah, well, it's Trump Tower 2.0 in his mind. The problem also exists that within Israel, we're seeing younger generation, very young generation, pushing back. A lot of the protests that have happened have been against Netanyahu for his interference in the constitution, and that's been going on for several years. Some theorize that he has incited this war, kicked it off and kept it going to keep himself in power. And then you have the larger problem of several generations of Israelis who have been sold the very propaganda that many in the West have received. I see them in a certain way as much the victims of this ideology. I know a lot of people are angry, Israelis should be on the streets, and I said, but I've lived there. And it's wild to talk to people who have no clue what's happening a few kilometers from their house. I mean, they literally do not know. They take an Egged bus, they can go to Hebron, they can go to their settlement. I'm traveling to go and meet parents of a suicide bomber. What should be a 15-minute ride is now 4 or 5 hour drive because I haven't taken the Egged bus. And they have no reality behind them as to what's going on. And they see young Palestinian men as all terrorists. And if you look what happened in the United States, oh my God, in my own country, post 9/11, under George W. Bush, we invoked the same Israeli policies. Men under 35 had to go and register for special registration. There were 14,000 men who were disappeared in the months following 9/11, totally disappeared. And I researched that for several years. And finally, my main informant for my book also disappeared. Taylor from Cairo. When I was speaking to many of the human rights organizations there, including the ACLU, and the ACLU was telling me, well, in the first days after 9/11, for many months, there was a queue of people down the stairwell. They were up high in like the 15th floor, even higher, all the way down. Around the corner, they were at the tip of Manhattan, near the ferry to Staten Island. And they were telling me how this went on for months. And women and men would come in and say, where's my father? Where's my brother? Where's my nephew? And nothing was done about this. It was just swept under the carpet. Not even Democracy Now! Wanted to cover this. Yet this kind of focusing in on men under a certain age, this is IDF policy. And I explained to people, do you understand that most people, even in the West Bank, which is a paradise compared to Gaza, cannot get to work? Because they are not allowed to travel because they're always suspicious. They're always being stopped and searched. Some are put on lists that they are legally not allowed to leave their village or their home. I said, this is severe. And so many people in the West have absolutely no clue about this. Yet, again, they can Google this, right? They can see the films.
They can Google it, but I mean, it's like the Germans who said they didn't know about the Nazis. You don't know about it if you are ideologically inscribed so that you don't look and you don't think and you don't work out. I mean, I've been to occupied Palestine Tel Aviv and Herzliya. And I previously had been to the north of Ireland when the conflict with the Irish Republican movement was on, and you see and understand because you have an analysis of imperialism and you have an analysis of what things mean. So that when I woke up in my Airbnb in Herzliya on the beach, and there's people out there surfing at 6 a.m, Jews out there surfing at 6 a.m, and then you hear these weird noises in the sky, and you look up, and heading north along the coast are attack helicopters. And you can't be in the position of being surfing on the beach in Herzliya and not know what those attack helicopters are about to do shortly after they've traveled north of Herzliya and turned right into the territories. You can't know. You can't not know what that is. You can't not know what's happening when you see on the train platform coming out of the airport hundreds of young men and women in IDF uniform. You can't not know what's actually happening. And the reason that they don't know and don't want to know, don't want to look it up, is because they are believers. They believe in this, and that of course is the issue that we face here with the question of anti-Semitism. Is that there are many thousands of people who are believers in the cult of anti-Semitism. Most Jews in the UK believe in the cult. Many other non-Jews who are pro-Israel believe in the cult. There, of course, are some Jews who are anti-Zionist, properly anti-Zionist, who have seen through the cult and have dissociated themselves from it. But the cult still exists. This cult of understanding that this is how the world is, and that cult, of course, will be further reinforced by the takeover of TikTok and CNN and CBS. But of course, most people in the world are not in the cult, and most people in the world see through the cult, and that's why they had to take over TikTok, not because it was run by the Chinese Communist Party, but because, like all social media, the vast majority of messages on Meta, on Facebook, on Instagram, on X are pro-Palestinian, because the vast majority of people in the world are pro-Palestinian. And even though these companies, including, of course, Meta and X, etc., use their algorithms to drown out pro-Palestine sentiment, they find it very, very difficult to do so. And they will try harder and harder to do it. And of course, they try, as everyone has seen, to ban pro-Palestine accounts, to sidetrack them, to shadow ban them, to use all the methods that they have. But nevertheless, the world has seen what Zionism is, and the world will not forget what Zionism is. So that they've got a really difficult problem on their hands, because they've lost the battle. And even though they have the resources and they send all these influencers in, they pay them $7,000 a post or whatever it is that they're doing, they have lost. I mean, the fact that they lost Charlie Kirk, they've lost Tucker Carlson, they've lost Candace Owens. These are themselves matters of consequence for them. And they illustrate the much wider loss that the Zionism's had. Zionism is a dirty word, and it's become much more of a dirty word in the last 2 years. 2 years ago, how long ago was it? I was sacked? 4 years ago now, is it? Mm-hmm. Nearly 4 years ago, I was sacked. To say then, as I was saying, that Zionism is intrinsically racist, it's intrinsically genocidal, that it must be opposed, that Zionism must be dismantled. That is, not just the occupation in Palestine, but Zionism all over the world. These were seen as being really radical and really very bad things to say. But now, the kind of things that I was saying then and I'm saying now are much less so regarded. People are much more sympathetic now to those kinds of ideas than they were, and that's because the genocide has opened people's eyes.
Absolutely. And in fact, I'm seeing more people laughing at being called anti-Semitic. Max has called it hundreds of times a day. And this has become worn thin to such a point. And this is something I said to the feminists on my wall today. I said, when you banter about lies about rape, you do realize that your whole platform about believe all women, you're weakening it. Because who's going to believe women when what you're saying, I had loads of women write things, well, rape is always used. So it happened. Yes, rape has been an historical tragedy within armed conflicts. We know that, and not even. But to say that because it has formed a history in armed conflicts means that it happened is incoherent. The same thing can be said for this accusation of anti-Semitism. Of course, there can be and there are anti-Semitic acts, but not everything is anti-Semitic, like you said earlier. If a Jewish person robs a bakery, then can we not discuss that as a crime? And these kinds of tripping over precise words becomes this kind of whack-a-mole. And the whack-a-mole on my wall is unbelievable. Hundreds of people are asking me, are you insane? And I said, well, you're a feminist, and you're the first person to say that women have been historically relegated to the mental institution or called crazy because she wanted to wear pantaloons. Now I'm crazy because I say that there was no rape on the 7th of October committed by Hamas. I find myself seeing the kind of pervasive ideological collapse by these groups. On the one hand, the Zionists, on the other hand, the feminist stroke Zionists, who want to just be right. It reminds me of that New Yorker cartoon where the guy's in the bed and he says to his wife on the computer, honey, it's time to come to bed. And she says, 1 minute, someone's wrong on the internet. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. No, I mean, it's collapsing. But the thing is that it won't collapse finally of itself. It needs to be pushed. And that's why, it's really very important that people understand that it won't be the collapse of the dollar or the emergence of the BRICS alliance or any of these, or the fact that IDF soldiers are getting PTSD or that businesses are closing in occupied Palestine. These things by themselves will not collapse the Zionist entity. It has to be collapsed by military means. And it requires an international military force to do that. Now, of course, that at present, the only international military force that we have, which is willing, or seems like it might be willing, is the Axis of Resistance, which, of course, unites the Palestinian resistance with Hezbollah, with the Iraqi resistance, and indeed, of course, with Yemen and the Islamic Republic of Iran. We desperately need that alliance to the Axis of Resistance to continue to militarily pressure the Zionists, and we desperately need other countries to join them. We need Pakistan to join them. We need any other country that was willing to enforce the rulings of the ICJ and the ICC. And that I fear is the problem that we're facing, is that the Zionism isn't going to die just of its own volition or collapse under the weight of its own contradictions or the waning of US imperial power. It will have to be pushed. And that I'm afraid, is the unpalatable truth.